It was one of those nights when the neighborhood felt unnaturally still. No cars passing by, no flicker of televisions visible through windows, just the hum of streetlights buzzing against the silence. I had always preferred to keep to myself, never getting involved in anyone else's business. But tonight, something didn't sit right. I noticed Mr. Klein's house across the street. The old man hadn't been around for days, his car gone, the windows dark, and the porch untouched. That wasn't unusual for him. He wasn't the friendly, neighborly type. We'd exchanged maybe a handful of words over the years. But then I saw them, two figures standing near the side of his house, shuffling around like they were looking for a way in. My stomach tightened. At first, I told myself it wasn't my problem. Maybe they were friends of his, though something about the way they moved screamed otherwise. Minutes passed, and I kept watching from my window, debating whether to call the police. But before I could grab my phone, I saw the men slip through the gate to Mr. Klein's porch. My curiosity won out over common sense. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way across the street. The night felt colder as I stepped off my porch and crossed the street, every shadow suddenly sharper under the faint glow of the streetlights. I told myself I wasn't doing anything stupid, just scaring off a couple of would-be intruders, giving them a reason to leave before things got serious. I kept to the shadows as much as I could, moving quietly along the edge of the fence until I reached Mr. Klein's yard. My heart raced as I crouched near the bushes lining his porch, close enough to hear the low murmur of the men's voices. They were standing just inside the front door, their words muffled but urgent. I leaned closer, careful not to make a sound. "He owes us. Has to be here somewhere," one of them hissed. The other man grunted, his voice thick with irritation. He knew we'd come, hid it before he left. This wasn't just some random break-in. These men knew Mr. Klein, and they were looking for something specific. My pulse quickened as I tried to piece together what they could possibly be after. I told myself to leave, to slip away before they noticed me. But before I left, I quickly called the police and described what was happening. But as I was walking away, I hit a misplaced stone and grabbed a garden plant to stop myself from falling. The sound was deafening in the silence. One of the men's heads snapped toward the porch window. His eyes locked with mine. My stomach dropped. Before I could think, I shouted the first thing that came to mind. "The police are on their way!" For a second, it worked. The men exchanged a glance, clearly startled. But then, just as quickly, they surged toward me, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floorboards. I panicked and stumbled backward, fumbling with the flashlight as they came closer. They were on me before I could run. One of them grabbed my arm, wrenching the flashlight from my hand and swinging it toward me. I ducked, but not fast enough. The corner of the flashlight grazed my shoulder, sending me sprawling to the ground. The other man dove after me, his hands clawing for my jacket. I kicked out wildly, catching him in the shin. He swore loudly, but he didn't stop. We fought clumsily on the porch, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. I managed to twist out of their grip for a moment, gasping for breath. But one of them shoved me hard, sending me crashing into the porch railing. I braced myself for the next hit, but it never came. The men must have decided they'd run out of time. They scrambled back inside the house, grabbing whatever they could. I saw one of them shove some papers and what looked like a jewelry box into his coat. Then, without a word, they bolted into the night, disappearing down the alley just as distant sirens began to wail through the quiet neighborhood. The sound of the siren could be heard nearby as the police cars pulled up in front of Mr. Klein's house. I was still slumped against the porch railing, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My shoulder throbbed where the flashlight had hit me, but the adrenaline kept the pain at bay. Officers swarmed the property, weapons drawn, moving quickly to secure the house. One officer helped me to my feet, asking if I was hurt. I shook my head, the words catching in my throat as I tried to explain what had happened. Inside the house, the police found overturned furniture, a broken window, and a few scattered belongings, evidence of a rushed search. But apart from that, there was little for them to work with. I described the two men as best I could, but my memory was already starting to blur. Faces that had been clear just moments ago now felt distant and hazy, as if the encounter had taken place in a dream. They knew Mr. Klein, I told the officer. They said he owed them something. The officer took notes but gave me a skeptical look, as though he had heard stranger stories before. "We'll make a report," he said, his voice professional but unconvinced. "Let us know if you remember anything else." The next morning, I watched from my porch. He stepped out slowly, his expression calm, too calm for someone whose house had been broken into the night before. I crossed the street as he unlocked his front door. "Mr. Klein," I called out. "Are you okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to say. He gave me a brief glance, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "I heard what happened. Thank you for watching out for the place." His tone was polite but distant, like someone going through the motions of gratitude without meaning a word of it. I followed him to the porch, waiting for him to offer some kind of explanation, but he didn't. "Do you know those men?" I asked cautiously. "They seem to think you owed them something." For a moment, Mr. Klein's expression flickered, something between irritation and sadness, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "It's nothing," he said quietly. "Nothing you need to worry about." He turned toward the door, effectively ending the conversation. I stood there, the questions piling up in my mind, but it was clear Mr. Klein wasn't going to answer any of them. The more I thought about the encounter, the less it made sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that the intruders hadn't just been looking for something, they had been looking for something specific. And Mr. Klein's behavior only added to the unease. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on his house, but nothing unusual happened. Mr. Klein's routine was as unremarkable as ever. He came and went quietly, kept his curtains drawn, and avoided talking to the neighbors. At night, I found myself replaying the fight on the porch, trying to recall the faces of the two men. But the more I tried to remember, the more the details slipped away, as though my mind was erasing them bit by bit. It was like trying to hold on to smoke. The police hadn't found anything useful in their investigation, just a few broken objects and some missing documents that Mr. Klein claimed weren't important. The men had vanished into the night without a trace, leaving behind more questions than answers. Days turned into weeks, and the incident began to fade from the neighborhood's memory. Life moved on, as it always does, but the sense of unfinished business lingered. Living alone in the forest was a choice I never regretted. Out here, everything made sense. No schedules, no traffic, no endless noise from the city. Just me, the woods, and a house I'd built with my own hands. Days passed without hearing a single human voice, and that was how I liked it. The forest was a world of its own, and I had found my place within it. The routine was simple: chopping wood, maintaining the house, and foraging for food or supplies when needed. Each day folded seamlessly into the next, with only the shifting seasons to mark the passage of time. The quiet brought me peace. The isolation wasn't for everyone, but for me, it felt like freedom. Out here, I was in control of my time, my space, and my life. Whatever happened beyond the edge of the forest didn't concern me. The outside world was just that, outside, and that was how I wanted it to stay. It started late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I was sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the light fade from the sky, when I heard it. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the distant hum of a car engine. Out here, that was rare. No one drove down these roads unless they had a reason. I set my coffee down and stood, listening carefully. The engine grew louder for a moment, then faded, as if the vehicle had stopped or changed direction. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the same wall of green, dense and silent. A prickle of unease settled over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. I told myself it was nothing, a hunter maybe, or someone lost on the back roads, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I locked the doors before heading inside, just in case. The first sound was subtle, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Then came the low murmur of voices carried on the night breeze. My heart quickened. I moved silently to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer out. That's when I saw them, 3 men moving slowly around the house. They were methodical, scanning the windows and the perimeter like they were looking for something specific. One of them shined a flashlight along the side of the house, illuminating the wood for a brief second before moving on. Another ran his hand along the frame of a window, as if checking for a way inside. I watched them for a moment, weighing my options. Confronting them directly wasn't an option, not 3 against 1, and certainly not without knowing what they were after. No, the best thing to do was disappear. I needed to get out, quietly. I moved through the house as silently as I could, heading toward the hidden door at the back. The door blended into the wall, a small trick I had built into the house for emergencies just like this. The hinges gave a soft groan as I opened it, and I winced at the sound. But the men outside didn't seem to notice. I slipped through the narrow opening, the cool night air wrapping around me as I stepped into the forest. The trees welcomed me like an old friend. I crouched low, moving carefully through the undergrowth until I found a spot with a clear view of the house. From here, I could see everything without being seen. The men didn't wait long. Within minutes, one of them forced the front door open with a sharp crack. They disappeared inside, their flashlights flickering against the windows as they began their search. I pulled out my phone, dialing the police with steady hands. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could, my location, the intruders, and what was happening. The officer on the line assured me that help was on the way, but I knew it would take time. Out here, everything takes time. All I could do now was wait and watch. Time stretched painfully as I crouched in the forest, the cool air clinging to my skin. From my hiding spot, I could see everything, the flicker of flashlights through the windows, the faint sounds of drawers being yanked open and furniture overturned. The men were thorough, tearing through the house with growing frustration. They weren't just after money or valuables. It felt like they were looking for something specific, something hidden. They cursed under their breath, muttering to each other as they pulled open cabinets and kicked through storage bins. Every so often, one of them would stop and glance toward the forest, as if sensing they were being watched. I held my breath each time, willing myself to stay perfectly still. They were too far from the tree line to spot me, but I couldn't afford to take chances. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I gripped my phone, listening for any sign of the police. My house, my sanctuary, was being ransacked, and all I could do was watch from the shadows, helpless. Then finally, the sound I'd been waiting for, the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through me, though I knew it wasn't over yet. The robbers heard the sirens too. Their movements inside the house became frantic, voices sharp and urgent. One of them barked out orders, trying to rally the others. They knew they were out of time. I stayed hidden as the first squad cars pulled up to the edge of the driveway, their red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. Officers poured out, guns drawn, surrounding the house in seconds. The intruders made a break for it. 2 of them sprinted toward the driveway, hoping to slip past the officers, but the police were ready. Shouts filled the air, followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the ground as the officers tackled the men and restrained them in handcuffs. But the third man was smarter, or luckier. I saw him slip through the back door and dart into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. The officers chased after him, but he was fast, and the forest was thick. Once the scene was secure, I stepped out from the forest, the cool night air brushing against my face. An officer spotted me and approached cautiously. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked, his flashlight scanning me briefly before lowering. I nodded. I called it in. They escorted me inside, and we walked through the wreckage together. Drawers had been dumped out, furniture overturned, and cabinets pulled from the walls. Papers were scattered everywhere, though nothing of real value seemed to be missing. "What were they looking for?" one of the officers asked, scribbling notes into his pad. "I have no idea," I said honestly. The truth was, I didn't keep much in the house beyond the basics. There was nothing here that should have drawn them to me. 2 of the men were already in handcuffs, sitting sullenly on the porch as officers guarded them. But the third man was still out there, somewhere in the forest. The officers offered to stay and sweep the area, but I declined. I knew the forest well enough to trust that if the third man was smart, he'd be long gone by morning. The police left with the captured intruders, promising to keep patrolling the area and search for the one who got away. As the last squad car disappeared down the dirt road, silence returned to the forest. I stood on the porch for a moment, taking in the wreckage inside my house. The damage was frustrating, but not devastating. I had survived worse. The mess could be cleaned up, the furniture put back in place. Life would go on. The night air felt cold against my skin, but it didn't bother me. This was my world, my home, and no intruders could take that away. I locked the door behind me, straightened the chairs that had been overturned, and swept the papers back into their drawers. When everything was back in place, I stood in the center of the room, letting the familiar quiet settle around me once more. The forest outside was dark and still, a silent companion that had watched over me for years. Whatever the men had been after, it didn't matter now. They were gone, and I remained. Life would continue, just as it always had. I'd been sitting on my couch, mindlessly scrolling through dating apps like I did most nights. It was a habit by now, a lazy search for something that felt meaningful, though I knew better than to expect much. Then I saw Amber. Her profile picture was perfect. Bright smile, dark hair, eyes that seemed too kind for someone you'd meet online. Her bio was simple, but just personal enough to feel real. I swiped right without hesitation. A match. The thrill hit me harder than I expected. Amber messaged first, and we exchanged small talk that somehow didn't feel forced. She was easy to talk to, too easy. She even suggested we meet the same night. "I'm not a fan of endless texting," she'd written. "Let's meet up and talk for real." It felt fast, but I was tired of overthinking. I agreed. She picked the Walmart parking lot, said it was open all night and safer than meeting at a bar. That made sense, I guessed. She wanted privacy without making it weird. But then she added, "Actually, meet me in the alley across the street. It's quieter there." That's when something in me hesitated. An alley? At this hour? But I told myself I was being paranoid. If I didn't stop doubting everything, I'd end up alone forever. I texted back, "Sure. See you there." When I pulled into the Walmart parking lot, the lights overhead cast a pale, yellowish glow over rows of empty spaces. I parked close to the store entrance, keeping my headlights on a moment longer than necessary. The lot was dead, except for a few scattered cars belonging to night shift workers. Across the street, the alley waited, dark and narrow. My phone buzzed. "Come to the alley," Amber's message read. "It's quieter here." I stared at the text for a second, that familiar doubt creeping in, but I ignored it. If I backed out now, I'd feel like a coward. I crossed the street, pulling my jacket tighter against the unexpected chill. The closer I got to the alley, the darker everything seemed. The streetlights here were dimmer, their light barely reaching the cracked pavement below. My footsteps echoed off the brick walls, and a strange tension wrapped itself around me. I kept my phone in my hand, scrolling through Amber's messages, trying to reassure myself. But the night felt off. The air seemed heavy, as if even the atmosphere was warning me to turn around. I ignored it. Just before stepping fully into the alley, I paused to check Amber's profile one last time. I opened the app, scrolled to our chat, and she was gone. The match was gone. Her entire profile had been deleted, leaving no trace. A knot formed in my stomach, and my thumb hovered over the call button on my phone. Then I heard movement. A shuffle of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from deeper in the alley. My breath caught in my throat. A figure stepped forward, a man, mid-30s, with an unshaven face and a lazy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice smooth but unsettling. I tried to step back, but my path to the parking lot was blocked. Another man appeared behind me, taller and broader, his hands stuffed casually into his hoodie pockets. I was trapped. I tightened my grip on my phone, trying to open the dial pad, but my fingers fumbled uselessly. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts raced too fast to focus. The men didn't move closer yet, they just watched, as if waiting for something. The larger man shifted his weight, and in one fluid motion, he grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, and I could feel the cold press of his fingers through my jacket. The other man took a step closer, his grin widening. I yanked my arm back, panic flooding my veins, but he held firm. "Where you going, buddy?" the smaller man asked, voice low and amused. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My body moved before my brain did. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted my arm free and bolted. My shoes slipped on the wet pavement, but I managed to stay upright, sprinting toward the Walmart parking lot as fast as I could. Their footsteps pounded behind me, closing the gap fast. My lungs burned, and every muscle screamed at me to keep going. The parking lot lights grew brighter as I neared the street. I was so close, just a few more steps. Then, out of nowhere, headlights swept across the alley. A police car pulled into the lot, its tires splashing through puddles. The two men stopped in their tracks. I heard them curse under their breath before retreating into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for air, legs shaky beneath me. The police car slowed but didn't stop, cruising through the lot before disappearing around the corner. The officers hadn't even noticed me. I collapsed into the driver's seat of my car, locking the doors with trembling hands. My heart was still racing, and I could barely catch my breath. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying everything in my mind. The messages, the alley, the two men. I pulled out my phone, fingers shaking as I opened the dating app. Amber's profile was gone, just like before. A hollow sense of dread settled in my chest. She was never real. I knew that now. I hovered over the app's icon, my thumb hesitating for just a second before pressing down hard. Delete. The screen blinked, and the app vanished from my phone. I sat in the car, staring out at the parking lot, now empty and still under the glow of the streetlights. The danger was over, but the fear lingered. I knew I'd escaped something terrible tonight, something I couldn't fully understand. As the chill of the night settled into my bones, one thought echoed through my mind. Never again. Never again would I let myself trust someone I'd never met. The days dragged by, each one feeling longer than the last. It was nearly the end of the year, and the holidays were just around the corner. School was winding down, and most of my classmates were buzzing with excitement, counting the hours until the break. I didn't have many friends, but that never really bothered me. My world was small, and that was fine. Morgana had always been a part of that world. She wasn't just my closest friend. She was the friend, the one I could count on for anything, or at least she used to be. Lately, things had changed. She had grown distant, like a shadow of the person I knew. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when it started, but it was there, the way she dodged plans, the way she looked distracted, always lost in thought. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that we'd get back to normal soon. Maybe the holiday break would be what we needed, a reset. I clung to that hope, not wanting to think too much about the nagging feeling that something was off. The last day of school felt like a blur. Teachers barely made an effort to hold our attention, and the halls buzzed with the sound of students making plans for the holidays. I was ready to disappear into the break, hoping the time away from everything would bring some clarity. Then, out of nowhere, Morgana approached me. I hadn't expected it. We hadn't spoken much in recent weeks, and I thought maybe she'd grown tired of me. But there she was, standing in front of me with that familiar half-smile I remembered. "There's a party tonight," she said, almost casually. "You should come." I blinked, caught off guard. It had been so long since she'd invited me to do anything that I almost forgot how to respond. "A party?" I repeated, trying not to sound too eager. "Yeah, at a friend's house. You'll like it. It'll be fun." Something about the way she said it felt strange, like she was forcing the words, but I pushed that thought aside. I wanted things to feel normal again. If this was her way of reconnecting, I wasn't going to question it. "Sure," I said. "I'll be there." That night, we arrived at the house together. It looked normal enough from the outside, just another house tucked away on a quiet street, with a dim porch light flickering in the cold night air. But the moment we stepped inside, a strange unease settled over me. The decorations were odd. Symbols I didn't recognize were painted on the walls, swirling shapes that felt both chaotic and deliberate. Ornaments hung from the ceiling, strings of bones, feathers, and other strange trinkets that didn't belong at a holiday party. The music playing in the background was unlike anything I'd heard before. It wasn't festive or familiar. It was slow and rhythmic, with haunting melodies that echoed through the room, wrapping around my thoughts like a fog. It didn't seem to bother anyone else. I stayed close to Morgana, feeling that something was wrong. She looked at ease, slipping into conversations with the other guests as if she belonged there. I told myself it was just my imagination, that this was just some weird artsy party. But deep down, I knew something was off. As the night wore on, I tried to mingle, hoping to distract myself from the creeping unease. The other guests were polite enough, but their conversations felt off, like they were speaking in half-truths, leaving out something important that I wasn't meant to know. I kept glancing at Morgana, hoping to catch her eye, but she was wrapped up in the crowd, moving with a confidence I hadn't seen in her before. It was like she had slipped to a different version of herself, one I didn't recognize. I thought about leaving. I even took a step toward the door, but something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the hope that if I stayed a little longer, everything would make sense. This was Morgana, after all, my friend. There had to be an explanation for all of this, so I stayed, even though every instinct told me to leave. I told myself it was just a weird night, that the strange decorations and music didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was in over my head, and whatever was going on, Morgana wasn't going to tell me. Not yet. It was close to midnight when the atmosphere shifted. The music stopped suddenly, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. The guests, who had been chatting and laughing just moments before, grew quiet. One by one, they began moving with purpose, as if following some unspoken command. I stood frozen, watching in disbelief as they started arranging candles in a perfect circle on the floor. A thick, metallic scent hung in the air, and someone began drawing symbols on the floor with dark chalk, shapes similar to the ones on the walls. It felt deliberate, practiced, like they had done this 100 times before. And then I saw her, Morgana, calmly stepping into the circle, her expression serene, like this was exactly where she belonged. She knelt among the other participants, her movements smooth and familiar. I stared in shock, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just some weird game or performance. This was something else, something darker. The guests began chanting, their voices low and rhythmic, blending into an oppressive hum that made the air feel heavy. The words were foreign, their meaning lost on me, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. I wasn't supposed to be here. My chest tightened, and a wave of panic surged through me. I had to get out, now. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run before it was too late. I glanced at Morgana, hoping for some sign of hesitation, something to indicate that this was a joke, that we could leave together and laugh about it later. But her expression was steady, almost peaceful, as if she had been doing this for months, maybe longer. I realized with a sinking feeling that Morgana had invited me here, knowing exactly what was going to happen. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. She had made a choice, and I wasn't part of it. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The chanting grew louder, more intense, as if it was pulling the walls of the room closer. I turned, bolting toward the door. I didn't care if anyone saw me. I just needed to get out. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I burst through the front door. My legs burned as I sprinted down the street, the house fading into the shadows behind me. I didn't stop running until the strange symbols, the eerie chanting, and Morgana's calm face were far behind me. The next few days passed in a blur. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I sent Morgana a message the next morning, keeping it short and careful. "What happened last night?" I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply, but none came. Hours turned into days, and still nothing. I told myself she needed time, that maybe I had misunderstood what happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had happened at that party had changed things between us, between her, and the rest of the world. A few days later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Morgana had transferred to another school. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. And just like that, the friendship I had cherished was over. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on, but the memories clung to me like shadows. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Morgana had looked that night, so calm, so certain, as if she had found something that made sense to her in a way I never could. I kept questioning myself, wondering if there was something I had missed, something I could have done to stop her from slipping away. But every time I replayed the events in my mind, I came back to the same conclusion. Morgana had made her choice, and it didn't include me. There was no closure, no satisfying explanation, just a hole where our friendship used to be. I told myself it was for the best, that some people change in ways you can't follow. But the truth was, I missed her. And no matter how hard I tried to forget that night, it stayed with me, a reminder that some questions don't have answers. I never saw Morgana again. Eventually, the memories of that night began to fade, becoming just another strange chapter in a life filled with unanswered questions. But every now and then, when the nights are too quiet and the air feels heavy, I think about her. And I wonder if she ever thinks about me too. The drive felt longer than it should have. The endless rain turned the narrow roads slick, with the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace. I kept glancing at Hannah in the passenger seat. She stared out the window, arms crossed, chewing her lip the way she always did when something was bothering her. We both knew why we needed this getaway, though we hadn't spoken about it aloud. When we finally arrived at the Airbnb, the house looked smaller than the photos had made it seem, a worn, wooden structure tucked deep in the forest. The rain turned the driveway to mud, and the trees leaned in closer than I'd expected, their branches weighed down with water. I stepped out of the car, and the cold dampness of the air clung to my skin instantly. No phone signal. Perfect. Inside, the place smelled like damp wood and old rugs. We threw our bags down, and I tried to make the best of it, said something about how cozy it could feel once the rain stopped. Hannah gave a half-hearted nod and sat on the couch, scrolling on her phone. I didn't say anything, but I knew she noticed it too. The Wi-Fi connection dropped every few minutes. I stared out the window at the wall of rain beyond the glass. It pounded hard enough to blur the view of the forest. The air inside felt heavy, and every creak of the house made me wonder if this trip had been a mistake. Still, I told myself we just needed to ride it out. We couldn't drive back even if we wanted to, not in this storm. It was well past midnight when the knock came. The sharp, insistent sound cut through the rain and made both of us jump. I exchanged a look with Hannah, and we both hesitated. Who would be out here in this weather? I peered through the peephole. A man stood there, drenched and shivering, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He looked like he'd been out in the storm for hours. When I opened the door, he gave me a crooked smile. "Car broke down," he said. "Can I wait inside just until the rain lets up?" Hannah stayed behind me, silent. I could feel her unease without looking. Part of me agreed with her. Something about him felt off, but leaving him outside felt cruel, so I stepped aside. "Come in," I said, forcing a smile. Mark dripped water onto the floor, shaking off his jacket with a grateful sigh. "Thanks. Couldn't believe I got caught in this mess." He sat on the edge of the couch, like someone who wasn't used to staying in one place for long. As he spoke, he asked odd questions. How long we planned to stay, if we'd stayed here before, whether the area was quiet. I answered vaguely, trying not to sound suspicious, but each question made my skin crawl a little more. Hannah sat across the room, watching him closely. She didn't say a word, but her eyes stayed fixed on him the entire time. After a while, Mark excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving his soaked jacket draped over a chair. I sat in silence, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. Hannah shifted uncomfortably, her foot tapping a quick rhythm on the floor. "Something's not right," she whispered, but I shook my head. "It's just the storm," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. A few minutes later, I noticed the edge of a black device poking out of Mark's backpack. Curious, I reached over and unzipped it slightly, just enough to see inside. A police radio sat nestled among a few other things. It hummed with static, the occasional burst of garbled speech crackling through. My heart pounded as I pulled it out. What was a guy with a police radio doing out here? When Mark came back, I held the radio up. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm off duty," he said casually. "Just like to keep an ear out for things." The answer felt too smooth, too rehearsed. I glanced at Hannah, and the look on her face said she felt it too. Something about Mark didn't add up, and then the radio crackled to life. A clear voice came through, cutting through the static. "Suspect at large. Approach with caution." Hannah's eyes locked on mine, wide and filled with panic. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm. Mark watched us both, his expression unreadable. I didn't know whether he'd heard the message or not, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I put the radio down slowly. "Storm's supposed to stop by morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "You can head out then." Mark gave me a tight smile, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long. Then he nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense." The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Every sound from outside, the wind, the branches scratching against the windows, felt amplified. I could see Hannah gripping the armrest of the couch, her knuckles white. We didn't dare sleep. Every minute felt like an hour as we waited for morning, hoping the rain would let up. But it only got worse, slamming against the windows like the forest wanted to swallow us whole. Just before dawn, there was another knock at the door. 2 officers stood on the porch, water dripping from the brims of their hats. One of them held up a photo, a grainy image of Mark, unmistakable even in the dim light. "He's dangerous," the officer said. "Have you seen him?" I glanced back toward the living room, my heart racing. The chair where Mark had sat was empty. The window beside it stood open, curtains billowing in the storm. We searched the house, but Mark was gone, vanished into the rain-soaked woods. The officers promised to search the area, but I knew they wouldn't find him. He was already long gone. Hannah and I sat in silence after they left, the sound of the rain filling the empty spaces between us. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with driving deep into the woods, leaving the world behind. That's what Rachel, Trevor, and I were chasing. A weekend away from everything. No emails, no noisy neighbors, no distractions. Just us, the trees, and the kind of quiet you can't find anywhere near the city. I took the lead on setting up camp. Rachel was great with the little details, organizing the gear, making sure the tent stakes were secure. Trevor wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type. He fumbled with the tent poles, mumbling curses under his breath. I tried not to laugh. "You'll get the hang of it," I told him, but he didn't look convinced. We picked a spot far off the main trail, exactly the kind of isolation we were looking for. The only sounds were the breeze rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. It felt perfect. But Trevor kept glancing around like the woods were hiding something. "We're really out here, huh?" he said, his voice carrying that nervous edge. "Relax," I told him. "That's the point." He gave me a weak smile, but I could tell it wasn't working. Still, we had the whole weekend ahead of us. I figured he'd loosen up eventually. By the time night fell, the fire crackled warmly between us, and we were finally unwinding. Rachel leaned back in her chair, roasting marshmallows over the flames, while Trevor sipped from his flask, trying to convince himself that camping wasn't so bad after all. The forest seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing just beyond the circle of firelight. I liked that feeling, being tucked away from everything. Then out of nowhere, Trevor sat up straight. "Hey, do you see that?" I followed his gaze toward the distance. Headlights. I could see them weaving slowly through the trees, getting closer. "What the hell?" I muttered. We were way off the beaten path, too far for anyone to just stumble upon us by accident. The vehicle pulled up, and 2 men stepped out, their uniforms reflecting the firelight. "Evening," one of them said. "We're with the sheriff's office. Mind if we take a look at your IDs?" Something about them didn't sit right with me. Their uniforms looked legit, but their body language didn't match. They were too casual, like they weren't used to wearing those badges. And then one of them glanced toward the fire. "Need to check your tents too," he said. "Safety inspection." Trevor fumbled for his wallet, but I stayed still, heart beginning to pound. There was no way real cops would show up here and act this way. The guy asking for IDs gave us a too easy grin, like he was trying to seem friendly but couldn't quite pull it off. "Your car matches a report," he added casually. Something about it being spotted at the scene of an accident. That's when it clicked. He was lying. There was no way they could have seen our car. No one had followed us, and we were hours from the nearest road. A cold weight settled in my gut. These guys weren't cops. Whatever they were here for, it wasn't good. I glanced at Rachel, and she caught my look. She knew too. Her hand tightened on the armrest of her chair. "Maybe we should pack up and head out," she said quietly. The men stepped closer, blocking our way. Their easy smiles dropped, replaced by something harder. "No rush," one of them said. "We just need to ask a few more questions." My pulse pounded in my ears as I looked at Trevor. He was already reaching for his phone, but the second man noticed, snatching it out of his hand with a sharp jerk. "What do you think you're doing?" the man growled, his voice low and dangerous. I knew panicking would only make things worse. If we were going to get out of this, we'd have to be smart. "It's fine," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "We'll cooperate." Rachel shot me a glance, her expression tight with fear, but she didn't say anything. I gave Trevor a subtle nod, signaling him to stay quiet. We had to play this right. The men relaxed slightly, thinking they had us cornered. One of them motioned for Rachel to step aside. "Let's chat over here," he said, his tone too smooth. I clenched my jaw as Rachel stood and followed him, her shoulders tense. The other man stayed with Trevor and me, keeping a hand on his belt like he was armed. I kept my voice steady. "Look, we just came out here to camp. We'll pack up and leave if that makes things easier." The man smirked. "That's not how this is going to work." My mind raced, weighing our options. If we ran now, we wouldn't make it far. They had the advantage of surprise. But if I could create a distraction, we might have a chance. I glanced toward the fire pit, an idea forming in the back of my mind. This was going to be risky, but it was the only shot we had. I caught Trevor's eye and gave him a look. "Get ready." I waited for the right moment. The guy with us stood too close, his smug grin making it clear he thought we had no way out. I could see Rachel a few feet away, her eyes darting between me and Trevor, waiting for a signal. I moved fast, too fast for the guy to react. With all the strength I had, I shoved him hard into the fire pit. He toppled backward, arms flailing as the logs and embers scattered around him, sending sparks flying into the cold night air. "Run!" I shouted, already sprinting into the forest. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed Trevor's arm, and together we plunged into the darkness. Behind us, I heard the guy cursing as he scrambled out of the fire pit, and the other one yelling. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet as we ran. The forest was a maze of shadows, and every sound felt amplified. Our pounding footsteps, the men's shouts, the snap of twigs beneath their boots. But fear kept us moving. Stopping wasn't an option. The forest swallowed us whole. Darkness pressed in from every direction, and it was impossible to tell where we were going. I could hear Rachel breathing hard beside me, her footsteps matching mine. Trevor stumbled, cursing as he caught himself on a tree trunk, but we couldn't stop. The men were close, too close. My lungs burned and my legs screamed for rest, but adrenaline kept me going. I glanced back, catching a glimpse of flashlights weaving through the trees behind us. They were gaining on us. "We need to split up," I whispered urgently, but neither Rachel nor Trevor answered. We were all too focused on the sound of the men getting closer, their threats cutting through the night like knives. The terrain grew rougher as we stumbled over roots and pushed through thick underbrush. The forest felt endless, and the cold air gnawed at my skin, but I didn't dare slow down. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between us and them. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we stumbled onto a narrow hiking trail. For a moment, the sight of it didn't register. It felt surreal after all that running through the wild forest. But then Rachel gasped, pointing ahead. In the distance through the thick trees, we saw a faint glow, lights. My heart soared as I realized what it was, a ranger station. We didn't stop to think. We ran, our bodies moving on instinct alone, feet pounding against the dirt trail toward the promise of safety. The ranger station grew clearer with every step. I banged on the door with both fists, panic flooding through me as I imagined the men catching up at any second. "Help! Open up!" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. The door swung open, and a man in a ranger's uniform stood there, his face twisting with confusion. "What's going on?" Rachel begged, and the ranger didn't hesitate. He ushered us inside, locking the door behind us. We collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping for breath. The ranger stared at us, clearly trying to make sense of what was happening. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp. There were these men, I managed between breaths. They pretended to be cops. They tried to take us. The ranger's expression hardened, and he reached for his radio, calling for backup. "Stay here," he said, glancing toward the windows, his eyes scanning the dark forest beyond. We waited in tense silence, the adrenaline slowly draining from our bodies. Trevor sat hunched over, clutching his knees, while Rachel wrapped her arms around herself, still shaking from the fear that clung to all of us. When the police arrived, they swept through the forest, searching for any sign of the men or their vehicle. But hours passed, and nothing was found. The officers returned empty-handed, their expressions grim. "No sign of them," one of them said, "or their car." The ranger gave us a reassuring look, but it did little to ease the knot in my stomach. "This is the first report we've had of anything like this," he said, "but we'll stay on high alert." We were safe now, but the relief I expected didn't come. Something about the way those men had vanished without a trace gnawed at me. It was as if they'd never existed at all. We drove home the next morning in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The forest we had come to for peace had shown us something else entirely, a reminder that danger can find you anywhere, even in the places you think are safest. The lights were the first thing that pulled us in. Bright, swirling patterns flashing in every direction, casting playful shadows on the colorful tents. The music, loud and upbeat, filled the air along with the sound of children laughing and prizes clinking as people won games. I glanced over at Karen, her eyes wide with excitement. Her hand gripped mine, warm and steady, pulling me further into the chaotic charm of the carnival. We let ourselves get lost in it, moving from one stall to the next, the night unfolding in a blur of rides, sugary snacks, and games we knew were rigged. Karen insisted on riding the Ferris wheel, and we laughed as we swayed at the top, the city's lights stretched far below us. It felt like nothing could touch us up there, suspended above the noise and movement of the world. The whole night had that feeling, like we'd escaped into a dream. We played until our arms were full of stuffed animals and won just enough candy to make us regret it. The crowd moved around us like a living river, and for a while it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But sometimes even dreams have edges sharp enough to cut. It started as a flicker of awareness, nothing solid at first, just a sense that something wasn't quite right. We were waiting at a game booth when I noticed the first man. He stood a few feet behind us, pretending to look at one of the stalls, but there was something off about him. His posture, maybe. Too rigid, too focused for someone just enjoying the night. I pushed the thought aside. It was a crowded carnival, after all. People lingered everywhere. But as we wandered toward another ride, I caught sight of him again, this time with another man by his side. Both of them were just far enough away not to draw attention, but I noticed them watching us. They followed us from one attraction to the next, hanging back just enough to make it look casual. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I didn't say anything to Karen. She was too busy enjoying herself, and I didn't want to ruin the night over something that could have been nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't leave, and every time I turned around, they were still there. We just stopped by a food stand for some candy apples when Karen asked me to grab her a few sweets from the cart nearby. I told her I'd be right back and left her waiting at the edge of the crowd. It only took a couple of minutes to buy the candy, but when I turned around, I saw one of the men standing next to her. Something inside me snapped. I pushed my way through the crowd, heart pounding, closing the distance between us as fast as I could. Karen looked confused, her smile faltering as the man leaned in, saying something too low for me to hear. "Hey!" I barked, stepping between them. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. The man backed off slightly, raising his hands like I was overreacting, but there was something in his smirk that made my skin crawl, something under his breath, just loud enough to be insulting, before turning on his heel and walking away, joining his friend a few feet away. Karen grabbed my arm, her voice soft with concern. "What's going on?" I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Nothing," I said, though my heart was racing. "Let's get out of here." I didn't want to alarm her, but I knew the men weren't just random strangers. Their presence felt deliberate, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out what they wanted. We weaved our way through the crowd toward the exit, my hand gripping Karen's tighter than before. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, every nerve on high alert as I scanned the crowd. The lights, which had seemed so inviting earlier, now felt disorienting, and the cheerful music grated against my nerves. As we approached the gate, my heart sank. There they were, the two men standing near the exit, their eyes scanning the crowd. One of them spotted us, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. It wasn't a coincidence. They had been waiting. Karen noticed them too. Her hand tightened around mine, and I could feel her fear mirror my own. We couldn't just walk past them. They'd follow us for sure. I glanced around, desperate for an idea, and that's when I spotted the security guard standing near the gate. I leaned close to Karen, keeping my voice low. "Stay with me," I said. "We're going to ask the guard to walk us to the car. Don't look back." Karen nodded, her expression serious now. We made our way toward the guard, trying to act natural, but I could feel my heart pounding harder with every step. When we reached him, I leaned in and explained the situation quietly, keeping my voice steady. "Those two guys over there, they've been following us all night. Can you walk us to our car?" The guard's expression shifted immediately, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the two men. He gave a quick nod. "Let's go," he said, positioning himself between us and the men. With the guard leading the way, we walked toward the parking lot, my heart thudding in my chest with every step. I knew we had only moments before things escalated, and I hoped we could get to the car before they made their move. The security guard led us toward the parking lot, his pace quick and deliberate. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and sure enough, the two men followed. They didn't even try to hide it now. Karen stayed close to my side, her grip firm on my arm. We kept moving, with the guard just ahead of us, his presence a small comfort. The festive sounds of the carnival faded behind us as the dark parking lot stretched before us. The cheerful lights of the ride seemed like a world away now, leaving only dim lamps casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. I tried to focus on the path ahead, counting the steps to our car, but my mind raced with what-ifs. Would they back off now that a guard was with us? Or were they desperate enough to do something reckless? We were about halfway to the car when I heard them closing in. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the lot. I turned just in time to see one of the men rushing toward me, his face twisted with determination. "Hey!" the guard shouted, stepping between us. The man didn't hesitate. He lunged at me, and I barely had time to react before we collided. We hit the ground hard, the asphalt scraping against my elbows and knees as we struggled. The guard was on him in an instant, pulling him off me and pinning him to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Karen stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth in shock. The man thrashed beneath the guard's grip, snarling curses as he tried to break free. For a moment, it seemed like we had the situation under control. But that's when the second man made his move. The second man sprinted toward Karen, grabbing her by the arm before I could react. She let out a startled cry as he yanked her away, dragging her toward the far side of the lot. "Karen!" I shouted, my voice raw with panic. I didn't think, I just ran. The security guard was still wrestling with the first man, so it was up to me. My legs burned as I sprinted after them, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The man moved fast, dragging Karen behind him as she struggled to free herself. But fear and desperation fueled me. I pushed harder, closing the distance between us step by step. He glanced back, realizing I was too close, and made the mistake of slowing down. That was all I needed. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground with every bit of strength I had left. Karen stumbled backward as we hit the pavement, and I felt the man's body slam beneath mine. He grunted, twisting beneath me, but I pinned him down, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. The guard arrived moments later, helping me restrain the second man while Karen stood nearby, trembling but unharmed. Together, we pinned him to the ground, making sure he wouldn't escape. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. The night air felt cold against my skin, but relief flooded through me. Karen was safe. We were okay. The two men lay on the ground, cursing and thrashing beneath our grip, but they were outnumbered now. The guard radioed for backup, keeping a firm hold on the first man while I kept the second one pinned. When the struggle finally settled and the men stopped resisting, I pulled Karen into a tight hug, feeling the weight of the night's events crash down on me. She was shaking, her breath shallow, but she was safe. That was all that mattered. We thanked the guard profusely as he assured us that help was on the way. With the situation finally under control, we climbed into our car, the engine's hum bringing a strange sense of comfort after everything that had happened. As we drove away, the lights of the carnival faded in the rearview mirror, the sounds of the night slowly disappearing behind us. We didn't speak for a while, the weight of the encounter still settling over us. But one thing was certain, we wouldn't be returning to that carnival anytime soon. The house stood at the edge of town, weathered but unchanged, as if it had been waiting for us to come back. It had been 4 years since our grandmother passed away, yet the place looked the same, just a little older, like all of us. The yard, once our playground, was overgrown now, the tall grass brushing against our legs as we walked up to the front door. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and dusty memories. The familiar creak of the floorboards greeted us, and for a moment, it felt like stepping back in time. The same framed photographs lined the walls, and the furniture remained in its exact place. We wandered through the rooms, calling out to each other, each discovery stirring a memory. Summers spent chasing each other around the house and listening to our grandmother's stories as the sun went down. That first night, the house felt more alive than I remembered, though not in a comforting way. The walls groaned with age and the windows rattled in their frames. As we lay in our old beds, I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible noises. Light footsteps perhaps, or something shifting behind the walls. I told myself it was just the house settling, maybe small animals nesting in the attic. Still, a strange feeling clung to me, keeping sleep just out of reach. The next morning, the sunlight filtering through the curtains brought with it a sense of ease. We shook off the strange night and went about the day as if we were kids again. My brothers found an old bow in the shed, and soon they were outside, laughing and launching arrows into the trees. Their voices echoed through the yard, carrying the joy of childhood memories, if only for a little while. I stayed inside, deciding to make lunch. It felt good to be in the kitchen again, the heart of the house where our grandmother once cooked for us. I hummed to myself, chopping vegetables and enjoying the rare moment of peace. The house felt quiet, too quiet, but in a way that almost felt intentional, like it was waiting for something to happen. I tried not to let the silence get to me, focusing on the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board, but that nagging sense of unease from the night before returned, wrapping itself around me like a cold breeze. That's when I felt it, the sudden crawl of cold on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My hands stilled, the knife clattering against the board. I glanced around the room, trying to shake off the feeling, but something in the air had shifted. The silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. Movement near the attic stairs caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. An old man, dressed in ragged clothes, slowly emerged from the attic door. His presence was surreal, as if he belonged to the shadows rather than the living. He moved with a strange kind of calm, not looking at me, not acknowledging my presence at all, as if I weren't even there. For a moment, I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath felt trapped. Then, without thinking, I bolted. I ran outside, the fear driving me forward until I found my brothers. I shouted, my voice shaking with panic. My brothers didn't hesitate. They grabbed a flashlight from the shed and ran inside, pulling me along behind them. We tore through the house, throwing open doors and calling out, but there was no sign of the old man. Every corner, every room, empty. We climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the old wood groaning beneath our weight. The space smelled stale and damp, the light from the flashlight sweeping across dusty boxes and old furniture. And that's when we found it. 2 makeshift sleeping areas tucked into opposite corners of the attic. Dirty blankets, torn clothes, and crumpled food wrappers scattered across the floor, evidence that someone had been living there. For how long, we couldn't tell. A chill ran through me as I realized the truth. This wasn't just a chance encounter. The man hadn't just wandered in. He had been here, living above us, unnoticed, for who knows how long. We stayed the rest of the weekend, though it wasn't the carefree trip we had imagined. Every noise, every creak of the old house felt like a reminder that we weren't truly alone. At night, I found myself lying awake, straining to hear the slightest sound from the attic, half expecting the old man to return. On the drive back home, none of us spoke much. The weight of what we had discovered stayed with us, heavy and unspoken. We didn't know who the man was or how long he had been there. The thought that we had spent our weekend in a house where strangers had secretly lived left us unsettled. A few years later, we decided to sell the property. None of us wanted to go back, not after what we had found. It didn't feel like our grandmother's house anymore. The warmth and nostalgia were gone, replaced by the memory of that silent intruder and the knowledge that someone had been living in the shadows, undetected.